Welcome to The Explainer. Look, today we're taking a brutally honest and, frankly, a highly cynical look at why the global economy feels less like some well-oiled logical machine and way more like a never-ending roller coaster of euphoric booms and absolutely terrifying busts. Forget the impenetrable textbook jargon for a minute. We're going to see how the economy is really just a giant, unforgiving mirror reflecting our own collective greed, our blinding optimism, and our incredibly, wonderfully short memory. So let's look at the gears, shall we?
You know, the billionaire investor Ray Dalio actually hit the nail on the head. He breaks this whole chaotic mess down into beautifully simple terms. He says these transactions are above all else driven by human nature. And it's so true. At its core, the economy isn't made up of confusing, high-level mathematical formulas. No, it's literally just a gazillion simple transactions. You buy an overpriced coffee, you get your paycheck, you take out a car loan you probably shouldn't. But because we humans are inherently emotional creatures, completely driven by FOMO and the desperate need for instant gratification, these simple little transactions snowball into massive, rippling economic cycles.
And to help us unpack this whole mess, consider these distinguished gentlemen our personal Greek chorus for the day. We've got the economic heavyweights, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Maynard Keynes. They'll be sitting right here, silently judging our terrible financial decisions throughout this entire explainer. I mean, look at them. They've seen this all before, and quite frankly, they are just exhausted by our behavior.
Okay, so the absolute core fuel of this chaotic machine, it's credit. Let's just define it accurately right now. Credit is the magical promise to pay money that you don't actually have yet. Just look at Keynes there, looking absolutely thrilled to hold that shiny piece of plastic. But here's the catch, right? When you settle a transaction with cold hard cash, it's over, done. But credit creates an ongoing cycle of debt out of thin air. When you borrow, you are literally borrowing from your future self. Sure, you get to consume way more than you produce today, but you are absolutely guaranteeing that eventually you're going to have to consume much less than you produce just to pay it all back. And that exact timeline, that's what sets the whole roller coaster in motion.
So this magical credit creation kicks off what we call the short-term debt cycle. And it's basically a step-by-step guide to total economic euphoria. Step 1, you borrow money. Step 2, you spend it recklessly. Now remember the golden rule of the economy here. One person's spending is another person's income. So, because you blew that borrowed cash, someone else just got richer. And since they feel richer, they feel super confident, so they go out, borrow more money, and spend it too. Demand skyrockets, prices rise, hello inflation. And the whole economy expands. We all sit back, look at our stock portfolios, and feel like absolute financial geniuses. But it's all an illusion, completely funded by promises.
And this debt-fueled party forces economic activity to shoot straight up to this euphoric peak. But remember that little trap we talked about? Debt has a repayment timeline. Eventually, the bill actually comes due. And to pay back that money, you are forced to finally spend less than you earn. So your spending drops, which means, you guessed it, the next guy's income drops. The cycle violently throws it into reverse. That terrifying plunge right there, that's a recession. It isn't some mysterious weather event that just happens out of nowhere. It happens purely because the credit cycle demands its repayment. Gravity is a harsh mistress.
It's really the ultimate contrast between the party and the hangover. During the expansion phase, easy credit flows like champagne. Everyone's having a great time. But when inflation inevitably gets out of control, the central banks have to step in. Think of them as the ultimate buzzkill chaperones at a high school dance. They hike interest rates to make borrowing expensive, which immediately dries up the credit. And boom, suddenly the hangover hits. The glaring fluorescent lights come on, businesses cut costs, people lose their jobs, and everyone swears up and down that they will never, ever borrow too much money again.
Until the next party starts, because of course they do. Each of these short-term cycles lasts about 5 to 8 years. And historically, if you look at the data, the bottom and top of each new cycle finishes with even more debt than the previous one. Why? Because we have terrible, goldfish-level short-term memories. We are driven by blind optimism and plain old greed. Human nature biologically pushes us to just push our luck, so we keep borrowing and spending more instead of actually doing the hard work of paying down our previous debts.
And that specific, incredibly frustrating human flaw gives birth to an absolute monster, the long-term debt cycle. Because we arrogantly refuse to fully eat our vegetables and pay down our debts in the short term, all that debt just steadily accumulates over the decades, rising so much faster than our actual incomes. This creates a massive, generational bubble that takes about 50 to 75 years to fully build up. People just look at recent history, they see asset prices going up, and they foolishly assume the good times are just permanent.
Honestly, think of the long-term debt cycle exactly like a game of Monopoly. In the early game, cash is everywhere, property is cheap, life is good. By the mid-game, you realize, okay, I need to leverage up. I need to borrow money to buy as many hotels as possible if I want to win. And it works beautifully, until you hit the late game. Suddenly, the entire board is covered in hotels, everybody owes everybody else rent, and literally no one has any actual cash left. When someone lands on your property, you desperately need cash to pay your own debts, but your pockets are empty. You are forced to liquidate, selling off your precious hotels at a massive, desperate discount just to survive.
To really understand how deeply we are currently sitting in the late game of our own real-life Monopoly board, consider this terrifying little metric. When the current long-term debt cycle began, right around 1944, U.S. government debt relative to the gold they actually held was about 7 times, so 7 to 1. Today, that leverage has exploded to an absurd 37 times. 37! The mountain of paper promises floating around out there completely dwarfs the actual hard money backing it up. It is, quite literally, a gigantic, systemic game of musical chairs.
And you know what happens when the music finally stops? You hit what economists politely call a Minsky moment. This is the absolute terrifying peak. Debt growth becomes utterly unsustainable because people's incomes simply aren't high enough to even make the interest payments anymore. So, the bubble pops. Asset prices crash. And that so-called wealth everyone smugly thought they had sitting in their accounts, it just vanishes into thin air. Why? Because it was never real wealth to begin with. It was just a collective hallucination fueled entirely by credit.
So when that Minsky moment hits, we enter a deleveraging. And guys, this isn't your regular weekend hangover. This is full-on, intensive economic rehab. It often results in a brutal lost decade. Because how do we actually get that giant mountain of debt back in line with actual income? Well, there are 4 really painful ways. First, austerity. Everyone panics, tightens their belts, and stops spending, which of course crushes incomes. Second, defaults. Businesses go bankrupt and debts are just wiped out. Third, wealth redistribution, which usually means aggressively taxing the rich. And fourth, the ultimate panic button. Central banks fire up the money printers.
See, normally, in a regular recession, central banks just lower interest rates to save the economy. Easy, right? But in a deleveraging, interest rates hit 0. Lowering them further does absolutely nothing, because terrified people flat out refuse to borrow any more money. Economists call this pushing on a string. So, faced with a deflationary depression where the entire financial system might literally collapse, the central bank inevitably panics. They turn on those magic money printers, aggressively pump newly created fiat currency right into the market, and intentionally devalue the money to make all that debt easier to pay off. The money becomes soft, and the whole crazy cycle resets.
Understanding this machine means finally accepting that it's driven entirely by our own predictable, deeply flawed human nature. So, the big question is, will you recognize the bubble next time? I mean, when your neighbor is getting rich buying up crypto, tech stocks, or real estate with borrowed money, will you actually see the peak of the debt cycle approaching? Or will FOMO take over, causing you to borrow even more money just to buy the next Monopoly hotel right before the crash? Keep questioning the consensus, guys, and always remember, the economic machine always repeats. Thanks for joining this explainer.